Welcome everyone to a brand new series here on the channel. I'm TheLividLion, and this is a new game spotlight for Remnant, From the Ashes. With E3 winding down, here's one of the games presented that really caught my interest. If you haven't heard of this game before, don't worry. I hadn't heard of this game till this week's in-depth interview at E3 with David Adams, president and co-founder of Gunfire Games, only to discover Remnant falls into the category of a looter shooter, one of my absolute favorite genres. These are also the guys who originally made up Vigil Games and were responsible for the Darksider series. I'm here today to wrap up everything core to the game that we know about Remnant From the Ashes ahead of its release on PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4 on August 20th. So let's jump right into it. Remnant, at its core, is a survival action looter shooter set in a post-apocalyptic 1968 Earth, where monstrous creatures seek to snuff out the last remnants of humanity. An ancient evil from another dimension has taken roots as humanity possesses the technology to open portals to the other realms and alternate realities in their attempt to uncover the mystery of this evil. You'll be able to venture alone or with up to 2 other players in seamless drop-in, drop-out co-op as you venture through a dynamically generated world containing a large variety of deadly enemies and monstrous bosses, all in an attempt to scavenge resources, build up your monster-slaying machine, and retake the world for mankind to rebuild. Now, while that all sounds like an absolute mouthful, from what I've seen and heard so far, this game is really elegant in its design. You'll notice almost immediately that the game is heavily inspired by the soulsborn genre, in both its gritty, menacing design of its creatures, to even the sheer perceived difficulty of the combat itself. With that comes death, and according to the devs, you will die a lot, so be ready for that. The most important thing to be aware of right from the start is that every playthrough is dynamically generated, from the bosses, quests, NPCs, and even the environment itself. The game at launch features 4 unique worlds that will change each time you play through them, creating new maps, new enemy encounters, quest opportunities, and dynamic in-world events. Speaking of the environment, the developers have already showcased 2 of the 4 main environments that we will encounter. Earth, being the main focus of the story, is broken up into 3 visually distinct sections. The city, a ruined cityscape that reflects the chaos of the time, with the debris-ridden streets and gutted buildings set against a backdrop of broken skyscrapers. The subway, where beneath the city sprawls a network of broken tunnels and rancid sewage corridors, with enemies lurking in the dark spaces around every twist and turn of the labyrinthine tunnel system. And lastly, the canopy, a hotbed of root activity. It is a massive arboreal expanse covering the sky and blotting out the sun. The ground is scarred with deep ravines and chasms created when the roots of the massive tree system ravished and upturned the land. Within this environment, players can expect to encounter the Root, a variety of terrifying incarnations from small, fast creatures with mouths like bear traps to enormous, lumbering behemoths that can easily slaughter entire teams of armed survivors if you aren't careful. I'll definitely be going into more details on these creatures in a later video. Also shown was the jungle world of Yesha, full of life, green, lush, wild, and most importantly, lethal. The jungle section makes up a large expanse. The village in Yesha is an elaborate and winding treetop village, home to the common folk of the Pan. And lastly, the ziggurat, where the Pan nobility ruled the region from ornate, massive ziggurats that dot the landscape. Here you will find the Pan race, incredibly agile, goat-like bipeds, with a unique, hierarchical society governed by an immortal priesthood. They are a strict culture made of only two castes, the commoners that form the bulk of the workforce, and the nobility, of which Pan priests are above all else. Definitely getting a heavy fantasy vibe from this race, and probably the coolest enemies I've seen so far. There are also two other worlds that we don't have details on yet, but we have a single piece of concept art for each. The Swamp and the Wasteland. Their main focus is on variety in the world with an emphasis on dungeon and boss fighting experience. What this means is if you find yourself fighting a root dragon in your world in a ruin-styled area, for instance, your friend in their world could be experiencing a completely different forest environment at the exact point of playtime. Or you could both be experiencing a forest, but the environment itself and the enemies you are facing within that environment could be vastly different. Now, being that this is a drop-in, drop-out co-op experience, this has some interesting implications for the progression aspect of the game. While your characters progress over time through leveling up their gear and acquiring traits by just playing the game, some of those gear pieces and traits can only be found through certain encounters and even puzzles hidden throughout the world. This is where the randomly generated worlds begin to have an effect on the co-op experience. If you are chasing a specific piece of gear that a friend or player you've come across has, there are a few options to be able to do this. First, you may re-roll your whole campaign and try to generate the combination of encounters or enemies that can potentially drop that reward. They are also introducing a mode called Adventure Mode that allows you to actually pick a specific area of your world and randomly regenerate that area of the game. You also have the option to join a friend's world if they have a particular instance or combination that you have been looking for. Because the world is randomized, you will encounter players with vastly different loot loadouts, just because everyone is having their own unique experience in different playthroughs and fighting different bosses at different times. Also, a shocking little tidbit of information. All of the loot in the game are essentially legendary items. Now that sounds crazy, right? Well, they are kind of flipping the typical loot system on its head with this game. Every time you complete an event, fight a boss, interact with an NPC, you'll be rewarded with a unique weapon, armor, talismans, or weapon mods, all of which can progress with you from the start all the way to the endgame through upgrades. Now you're probably thinking, if everything is legendary, how exactly do you level up or really progress with the loot? Instead of item rarity dictating power, all items in the game can be upgraded over time. They begin at level 1, but as you upgrade them, it helps you to determine if you are up to the challenge of higher and higher tier enemies. This essentially makes all weapons, armor, etc. desirable to chase purely based on how much you enjoy the functionality of those specific pieces. If you end up finding a weapon that you really like at the start of the game, you can carry that all the way through to the end game. Now that's awesome. That actually gives your personal investment in the loot you acquire and makes you attached to the pieces that may have gotten you through that difficult content in the first place. The team also wanted to emphasize that there are tons of armor possibilities, tons of magical items and trinkets, and tons of weapons, both melee and ranged. Your character has 2 slots for ranged weapons and 1 slot for melee. You start the game as an archetype in terms of classes, choosing from hunters, ex-cultists, or a scrapper, but it is merely a starting loadout that you pick, and it comes with a starting class mod for free, which we'll get into later. Every character can acquire any piece of loot in the game, so at the end of the day, your class and loadout is entirely up to you and can be dynamically changed as often as you like. This is just merely a starting point for you. With that though, they mentioned there are various healing, damage, and buffing abilities that synergize with one another that aims to encourage team play and kind of traditional classes as you build your characters. Being the developers of Darksiders, there is also a full melee combat system complete with iframes and combat dodging, as with most soulsborn experiences. It is important to note though that your dodge will change based on your equipment and the encumbrance as well. The guns, however, are the bread and butter of the game, with a handgun style slot and a long gun style slot. There are typical archetypes such as shotguns, snipers, pistols, but there are also other types that are more in line with the fantasy environments you will encounter along the way as well. Guns have the ability to equip mods, which equates to spells in Remnant. Some mods only have 1 charge, while others can store multiple charges. Once powered up, the player can activate the mod and unleash the special effect. You can swap mods whenever you please, but doing so resets your mod's power. A weapon that is modded allows you to do such things as light enemies on fire, summon allies to fight with you, leave a healing aura on the ground, or even see through walls. These weapon mods are more representative of your active abilities, while the traits your character earns over time become your passive abilities, and quite a few of these traits require you to discover certain secrets along the way to acquire them. As you augment your weapons with things such as root magic, your once normal, human-looking shotgun can become a root shotgun, with vines, roots, and leaves twisting in and out of the weapon, further adding to both the variety in looks and the gameplay as well. This increases the possible tactics across your team, and allows you to essentially specialize your character's playstyle in your group however you want. Armor was also said to have special abilities as well, but they didn't go into too much detail on that yet. As you acquire new gear and weapons, you'll find yourself frequenting the hub area called Ward 13, which is essentially your centralized base. Most of the vendors and merchants can be found here, and events in the world can sometimes result in new merchants visiting your hub. While exploring the world, you will find and loot valuable scrap that can be spent at vendors in Ward 13. Scrap and other items you find on your adventure are useful for purchasing consumables, upgrading gear, crafting weapons, and more. Enemy threats you eliminate along the way will also have a chance to drop scrap, and sometimes they will even drop a rare upgrade material. The more difficult the enemy, the more valuable the resources. When you've gathered enough resources, you can head back to Ward 13 and talk to the upgrade vendor. Upgrading weapons will increase the damage of the weapon, and upgrading armor will reduce the damage you take while wearing that armor. You'll need to constantly be upgrading your gear in order to take on tougher and tougher bosses. This leads us to the major focus of the game, the boss fights. They didn't reveal the exact number, but in an interview with IGN, they said roughly in the area of 24 to 25 completely unique bosses at release. Of these, there are dungeon bosses as well as 11 world bosses, which are much stronger encounters that require much more coordination and tactics to take down. Every boss is unique with its own set of mechanics aimed to challenge the player in different ways. They will have a large variety of telegraphed attacks that reward the player for their knowledge of specific enemy mechanics. We've seen a few of these so far. There is one very heavily aggressive melee-focused boss that you might encounter in the sewer area, while another that they mentioned, called the Totem Father, places totems that need to be managed while fighting him. They aim for these bosses to be hard and really designed for group play in order to take them down. The environment itself also plays a huge role in each of these bosses' arenas. Cover is fully destructible, which in fights such as with the Root Dragon, some of his ranged attacks are very hard to dodge and better tackled from cover. Over time, however, that cover will be destroyed and limit the player's options to avoid attacks as the battle draws on. It's imperative that you work to support each other in every fight. When one or more of you go down during a fight, your teammates will have a limited time to revive you before you die. If you die, you will not be able to respawn until at least one of your teammates reaches a World Stone or Shard checkpoint to initiate a resurrection. If your entire team dies, you will all respawn back at the last checkpoint, and your enemies will fully repopulate. As you adventure across the worlds of Remnant, keep an eye out for secrets as well. There are a ton of secrets in the game, some that are extremely complex because some may require a combination of events that may not generate in your currently rolled world. You'll also be able to find hidden lore all over the world in books, computer terminals, scraps of paper, dead NPCs, and more, for those itching to really find out about the backstory of this universe. Overall, I am super excited for this game that seemingly came out of nowhere. It seems to bring a really hardcore experience to dynamic group play, and with guns. Something I'd honestly never thought I'd be seeing in a Soulsborn-like game, and it has me really excited. I'll go ahead and link their website in the description below for you to check out for yourselves. And it is even up for pre-order right now with some exclusives for doing so if you're into that sort of thing. I aim to cover all the enemies in detail in their respective zones in some other videos on this channel, so keep an eye out for those as well. I want to thank you all for stopping by for this brand new series as I aim to expand the range of content on this channel. There are a ton of games from E3 I'd love to cover still, but this one really hooked me for a lot of good design reasons, and I felt you should all keep this one on your radar. Remember to toss a like or a sub if you enjoyed this video and share it around so I can keep pushing to bring you more videos like this when I have the time. Take care everyone, and I hope to see you all back here for the next New Game Spotlight.